Today we're going to discuss Chapter 8, how to find market equilibrium and determine our product price in an area called perfect competition. When we've taken a look at the firm's original supply curve, it looks a lot like a marginal cost curve. But let's remember, when we took a look at the marginal cost curve, there was a shutdown point that happened at the area where we were covering our average variable costs. And at the shutdown point, we realized that any place beyond that, we would have output. And conversely, at every place below that, we would have less output or zero output because, of course, the business would have been shut down. So when we look at the firm's supply curve, it is just the marginal cost curve from every spot above the shutdown point. So the left side of the curve is no longer valid because we cannot produce or provide supply if we are shut down. So every individual firm has a supply curve. We also recognize that there is a market supply curve. We take a look at the market supply curve, and in this case, look at Gary Grower and I'm a gardener. If the price is at 50 cents, Gary doesn't have a desire to supply a quantity, nor does Ima. So the market supply curve at 50 cents is zero. If the price of broccoli increased to $1, we can see that at $1, Gary's willing to produce a ton and provide a ton of broccoli. Ima, at $1, is still not willing to produce or provide any supply. So the market supply of all of our producers at this juncture is just the 1 ton. As price increases, we can see at $1.50, Gary is willing to produce 2 tons. At $1.50, Ima is willing to produce 1. And so the market together is willing to go ahead and produce 3 tons overall. So the market supply is certainly related to the individual firm supply. We just see the firms added together. As firms are added together, we understand that the producers are attempting to go ahead and create their profitability, or we may also communicate that as producer surplus. When we look at the supply curve, and at $4 a pound, there were areas that producers may have been willing to supply, but at $4 a pound, at that product price, at that price per, the ABC triangle demonstrates the producer surplus. So as price goes up from $4 to $6, there is more and more producer surplus. So if you considered and thought about your individual product that you selected in week number 2, if people are willing to pay more and more money to you, most producers are willing to supply more and more. We can take a look at equilibrium in perfect competition. Remember, when we're in perfect competition, that means there are a homogeneous product. That means there are a lot of producers. That means that they have a similar knowledge. And it also means that there are no challenges to entering and exit the market. So in perfect competition, if we take a look at consumer number 1 and consumer number 2, when you add those two together, it will simply give us our overall market demand. And producer number 1 and producer number 2, when they are willing to provide products, it comes up with an area of equilibrium. In this example, consumer 1 wants 6 units, consumer 2 wants 3 units, And producer number 1 is willing to provide 5. Producer number 2 willing to provide 4. So the equilibrium, there are 9 units provided for the consumers that are demanding 5 units. That's the nature of equilibrium. The amount of products that consumers would like are provided to the consumers by the producers that want to provide them. But equilibrium isn't always that easy to provide. We have a market supply curve and a market demand curve. And in the center of the market supply and the market demand curve, we have equilibrium. And in this case, the equilibrium exists where the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded are the same at an individual price. But let's just say perhaps the price was a little bit lower. So at price 1, at a lower price than equilibrium, you'll notice that the suppliers, the producers, they are not interested in supplying a significant amount. They aren't making a lot of money, and so they're at that cheap price. The supply is not very high, or the desire to supply is not very high. But from a consumer point of view, at that cheap price, the consumers are demanding. They want a lot of that product. It's really, really cheap. Give me more and more and more. So we have a big demand and a small supply. And we call that concept a shortage, meaning that there is less product than the consumers want. Now, if you are a consumer and you want the product and there is a shortage, what can you do? How do you get a part of that product that's in limited supply? Typically, we have to go ahead and pay a little bit more. We're kind of in a competition. There's not a lot of product available. If you really, really want it, you got to pay a little bit more money. And so what begins to happen is there is an upward pressure on price. And as price goes up, as people are willing to pay more and more and more, the producers, the suppliers are willing to supply more and more and more until we get to the equilibrium place. So when there is a shortage of product, there is an automatic upward pressure on price. In the same way, we can take a look at an increase in price. Now, price is a little more expensive. The consumers are demanding less and less and less. Because the price is so expensive, some consumers simply can't afford, and so the demand by the consumers is down. But now, if you are a producer and the price is going up, how much are you willing to supply? At that price point, we can see the consumers are willing to supply a lot. This is a great price. I'll sell a lot of the product to you. But now we have a situation where we have more product in the market than the consumers want. And we would call that idea a surplus. So if there is a surplus of your product and you really want to get it sold, what are your options? Well, a part of it depends on the type of product you have. If you are a dairy producer and you're producing milk, it has a pretty short shelf life. If you are producing almonds, you might be able to hold it aside and sell it in the next market. But generally speaking, when we have a surplus, if you as a producer want to sell your product, the best way to do that is begin to lower the price. So when we find markets in a surplus, there's normally an automatic downward pressure on price. The producers are willing to lower the price that they're selling the product because They want to get it sold. And remember, we are in perfect competition, meaning that we all have a homogeneous product. We don't have the ability to say, my asparagus is better than somebody else's. In perfect competition, all the product is the same. So if you don't lower your price in a surplus environment, you won't be able to sell your product in a surplus environment. So just recognize, as we are working our way towards equilibrium, there are differing pressures on price that go up or go down. Equilibrium oftentimes changes, and it doesn't just change because of price structures. There are other areas that can cause changes in equilibrium. We may see changes in equilibrium because of a shift in supply. If supply shifts, there becomes a new equilibrium price. And supply shifts are relatively normal. There are several areas that can cause a supply shift. Let's just say your input costs have gone up. If the cost of water goes up, you may not be able to purchase as much water as you need, and therefore you are not able to supply as much product. Maybe the seed costs went up. Maybe the California power costs went up. Technology can also cause a supply shift. Generally speaking, technology causes supply shifts out to the right, an outward supply shift. If you're looking at technology like irrigation technology, because we now have micro irrigation, or maybe we're talking about hybridized seed, and we've been able to create a higher quality seed through technology. Technology normally causes a supply shift to the right side. Government policy and incentives can also provide and cause supply shifts. If the government is providing an incentive to produce soybeans, and they're willing to pay you a little bit extra to produce soybeans, that will cause an outward supply shift. If all of a sudden the government quits providing incentives to produce soybeans, and they aren't going to pay you a little bit extra, will you produce as many soybeans? Probably not, and it would cause an inward supply shift. The price expectations. If you are expecting prices to go down, if you're expecting low prices, we had a really, really rough year in 2020, prices were down. If you're expecting more of the same in 2021, that may cause a shift in supply because we will not produce as much. Or conversely, if you're expecting there to be prices to be really, really good next year, you might go ahead and plant more, produce more, and cause an outward supply shift. Mother Nature can cause a supply shift, whether it is a California drought or flooding in Oklahoma. And of course, global events can cause some trade shifts as well. If China has a bumper crop of cotton production, then people will have less of a demand for ours. And so, because we know cotton is being produced in China, perhaps we'll produce less cotton or produce a differing crop. So there are shifts in supply, and just realize what happens is a new equilibrium occurs. Something else is happening when there is a supply shift. Here you can see an outward supply shift. Supply is shifting outward to the right, but also what you can see is there's been a change in demand. When you see a shift in supply, there is automatically a change in quantity demanded. So whether supply shifts outward and quantity demanded increases, or if supply shifts inward, we'll see quantity demand decrease. But when you see a shift in supply, you are also seeing a change in quantity demanded. And we have discussed in the past demand shifts, whether it's own price, other price, income, or preferences that can cause a demand shift. A similar piece is happening. When demand shifts, an outward shift in demand, you're also seeing a change in quantity supplied. There's a new equilibrium because there is a new quantity supplied. And if demand shifts inward, there is less of a consumer demand. There's also going to be a change in quantity supplied. So when you see a shift in demand, there's also a change in quantity supplied. And when you see a shift or a movement in supply, there is a change in quantity demanded. And finally, we take a look at the overall economic welfare of society. How well are we doing as equilibrium is occurring? Well, there's really two pieces that we take a look at. We want to understand what the consumer surplus, what kind of value are the consumers having in the market, and then what kind of value occurs with the producer surplus. And when you add those two together, we have our societal surplus. Let's take a look at it. The consumer and producer surplus. You can see here, anything that is to the outside of the demand curve. This area is the consumer surplus. And everything to the left side on the supply curve at equilibrium will show our producer surplus. Graphically, it's kind of like this. At our equilibrium points, you can see this is along the demand curve and consumers' demand, so we're evaluating consumer surplus. This section through here is along the supply curve, so we're evaluating supply or producers, and that will tell us our producer surplus. Now, we can calculate and quantify surplus just by calculating what the volume of the consumer surplus triangle and the producer surplus triangle happens to be. Areas of triangles are 1/2 base times height. So on the consumer side, we could take 1/2 of 6 times 6, which is 36, or 18. On the producer side, it's a very similar concept. 18 on the producer side. The triangles are exactly the same. But when we look at the economic surplus, we take the consumers plus the producers, and that would tell us there is an economic surplus of 36. So economically, society is doing well at this equilibrium. Now, if there is a shift in either demand or supply, it changes our economic surplus. Let me give you an example using an inward supply shift. We still have a consumer surplus and a producer surplus, and we now have a new equilibrium point. With this inward shift, we can now see we have a new consumer surplus and we have a new producer surplus. Are we better off or worse off? When you calculate the new consumer surplus and the new producer surplus, we can tell it's now at 12.5. And our economic surplus is 25. So are we doing as well as we were? We went from a 36 economic surplus to a 25 and telling us we had a societal loss. This purple section is the amount of our societal loss. We didn't do quite as well when there was an inward shift in supply. So whether it's an inward shift in supply or an outward shift in supply, we can recalculate what the economic surplus is and determine are producers or consumers or is society better or worse off. So we have our summary of key concepts, and remember at the end of every chapter I'm also providing the abbreviations that were in that chapter to help you out with your abbreviation assignment. If you have any questions, please reach out to your professor through the Ask the Professor form.